The heat clawed at her skin like a branding iron, and every breath scorched her lungs. Dust choked the air, the taste of copper and fear thick on her tongue. She crawled, one arm dragged into the gravel, the other wrapped tight around her belly. Her swollen wound throbbed with pain, but the baby inside kicked, a stubborn, small reminder that she wasn't dead yet. Clara, Mae Dawson didn't know how long she'd been crawling. The sun had climbed and dipped once already, shadows stretching long behind jagged rocks and skeletal trees. Her dress, once ivory lace, was now bloodstained and torn, clinging to her legs like old rags. A boot had ripped straight through them, her bare foot dragging raw across stones. She lifted her head. A buzzard circled overhead. "No," she rasped. Her voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. "Not yet." The wind answered with a low moan. The prairie stretched wide and empty before her, unforgiving. She couldn't see the wagon anymore or the trail they'd taken, but she remembered every second of betrayal. Jeb's voice still echoed in her ears, flat, without remorse. "You're a burden, Clara. Ain't no place for a screaming babe where we're going." He looked down at her, like she was a dog he was too tired to beat. One bullet had ripped through her shoulder. Another grazed her thigh as she ran. She hadn't seen where it came from, maybe Jeb, maybe one of the boys, but she remembered the way her knees had buckled. She'd hit the earth hard, rolling down a shallow gully, too breathless to scream. They hadn't checked if she was dead. That was their mistake. A stab of pain twisted through her abdomen. Clara clenched her jaw. She wasn't due for weeks, at least she thought so, but everything inside her felt wrong now. The baby shifting like it too sensed danger. She had to keep moving. If she lay still, she'd die, and worse. She'd die with her child still inside her, never given a chance to cry, to live. She dragged herself forward again, fingernails breaking on stone. She came upon a trickle of water, barely more than a ditch cutting to the land, but it was something. Clara plunged her face into the muddy stream, gasping as a coolness shocked her system. Her body wanted to collapse, to surrender to the earth, but a voice inside her screamed louder. "Move!" She rolled onto her side and lay there, catching her breath. Her eyes stung with dust and tears. How had it come to this? Her daddy had been a preacher in Abilene, stern but kind. Clara remembered singing hymns on Sundays, wearing white gloves and polished shoes, her mama brushing her hair out with fingers full of lilac perfume. She'd been 16 when she met Jeb Dawson. 25, charming, dangerous. He wore sin like perfume and made her feel like she was the only girl in the world. By 17, she'd run off with him. By 24, she was his bruised and broken wife. She should have left the first time he hit her. She almost did, but then he'd bring flowers, promises, that sweet smile he only gave her when no one else was around. He never touched her face when he beat her. Didn't want to ruin what he called his pretty little trophy. She'd gotten good at hiding bruises. When she told him she was pregnant, he went quiet for days. Didn't touch her. Then one night, he came home smelling of blood and whiskey, sat beside her and murmured, "It ain't the right time, Clara. Not with the marshals on our tail." She thought he'd come around. She really did. Instead, he'd shot her. A sudden crack echoed in the distance. Gunfire. Clara froze, heart hammering. Coyotes howled in reply, eerie and close. She twisted, trying to find shelter, but there was nothing but dry brush and a few sun-bleached rocks. Her vision blurred. The pain in her shoulder pulsed with every heartbeat, and her thigh throbbed like it was on fire. She wasn't going to make it. Not like this. And yet, she couldn't die. Not here. Not like this. Tears welled in her eyes, burning as they fell. "Please," she whispered, to God, to the wind, to anyone who might be listening. "Help me." The sun sank lower, bleeding red across the sky. Shadows lengthened, and the chill of dusk crept in fast, clinging to her damp skin. She tried to stand but collapsed in a heap, breathing shallow, bones trembling. Her belly tightened again, another contraction, sharp and wrong. She whimpered. Then a sound, soft, deliberate, footsteps. She couldn't see who it was. Just the outline of a man, tall, lithe, rifle strapped across his back, braids falling over his shoulders. His face was painted with the colors of earth and ash, his eyes like stone under twilight. Clara's breath caught. "No!" she gasped. "Don't, please." She tried to crawl backward, but her limbs wouldn't obey. Everything in her screamed to run, to fight, but her body had nothing left to give. The man didn't move closer. He stood still, watching her. Then slowly, he set the rifle down, hands open. "I won't hurt you," he said softly. His voice was deep calm, not accented, but careful, like someone who measured words before speaking them. "You're bleeding." Clara's heart pounded so loud it drowned out everything else. He stepped forward. She flinched. He knelt. A long pause. "You are with child," he said. Not a question. Clara nodded, barely. He looked at her wounds, then back into her eyes. "I will carry you, but you must trust me." She didn't trust anyone. Not after Jeb. Not after everything. But her vision was going dark, and her baby kicked like a frantic drum inside her. She gave the faintest nod. Strong arms lifted her, surprisingly gentle. She hissed in pain, clutching his shoulder as the movement jolted her injuries. "Easy," he murmured. "I have you." The world tilted. She clung to consciousness, blinking at the star-pricked sky. He smelled of leather, sage, and smoke. She managed one last whisper before blackness took her. "Who are you?" But the night had swallowed her voice. When Clara opened her eyes again, the world was different. Warmth, firelight flickering against stone walls, a fur-lined bedroll beneath her. The sharp, clean scent of herbs and wood smoke filled the air. She tried to sit up, cried out, and fell back with a gasp. "You shouldn't move." He was there, the same man, sitting near the fire, polishing a curved knife. "You lost much blood." Clara's hand flew to her stomach. "It lives," he said before she could speak. "Your child is strong." Relief broke over her in a wave so sudden, she sobbed. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he added, "I saw the trail. Gunshots. Blood. You were left behind." She turned her face away. "I do not know what kind of man does that," he said quietly, "but he is not a man." Clara didn't answer. He set the knife down and reached for a bowl. Steam rose from it as he approached, a wooden spoon in hand. "Eat." She looked at him, suspicious. "Not poisoned," he said. "If I wanted you dead, I would not have carried you miles through the desert." A beat passed. Then she took the bowl and sipped. It was broth, rich, hot, strange, but good. He watched her a while longer, then said, "My name is Tossin. T." She blinked at him. "Ta what?" He repeated it slowly. "Means he who walks in twilight." Clara stared into the fire. He didn't ask her name. She offered it anyway. "Clara." Another long silence. "I'll be gone in the morning," she said, though she could barely lift her arm. "You don't have to keep me." He nodded once. "You can go when you can walk." She frowned. "You don't care who I am?" "Tossin." T stood, tossing another log onto the fire. Sparks burst into the air. "I care what you do next," he said, voice low. "Not where you came from." She lay back, heart pounding. Outside, the wind whispered over the rocks. Coyotes cried in the distance. But in the circle of firelight, she felt, if not safe, then at least no longer alone. Still, something dark gnawed at the edge of her thoughts. Jeb, he wouldn't let this go. If he found out she was still alive. No, she wouldn't think about that now. Clara rested a hand on her belly. The baby kicked once, then settled. She closed her eyes. Sleep came fast. But morning, and the reckoning it would bring, was already on its way. A fire crackled low in the cave, casting flickering shadows along the walls. The scent of pine smoke and crushed herbs lingered in the air. Clara stirred, wincing as she tried to sit up. Pain blossomed in her side like a cruel flower, but it was duller than before, muted, as if someone had tended to her wounds while she slept. She looked around. The blankets were soft buffalo hides, and someone had propped her up with care. A woven pouch of dried flowers hung near the cave's entrance, their aroma blending with the smoke. Her dress had been cleaned of blood and patched, though modesty was preserved. Everything was quiet except the fire and the gentle hum of the wind outside. Then she saw him, Tossin. T sat at the cave's edge, sharpening a stone knife. His movements were slow, deliberate, focused. His long black braids framed a face carved with calm resolve. He didn't look up when she moved. Didn't need to. Somehow, Clara felt he knew her every breath. "Morning," she murmured, voice hoarse. He nodded. "You lived." Disappointed? He set the knife down. Relieved. Clara pulled the hide tighter around herself. Her gaze dropped to her stomach. The baby was still, resting like her. She breathed out slowly, trying to steady the knot of fear and confusion curling in her gut. "You saved me," she said after a pause. "Tossin." T glanced at her. "You were not ready to die. I didn't give you much choice." There was always a choice. She didn't know what to make of that. She'd known men who helped only when there was coin or obligation or lust in their eyes. But this man, this quiet stranger with warrior's eyes, had carried her across the desert, tended her wounds, and asked nothing in return. She didn't know his story, but she knew pain when she saw it. "You got a wife?" she asked, before she could stop herself. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Had. Clara nodded once, understanding more from that single word than she expected. She shifted, trying to sit upright again. Her whole body screamed in protest, but she gritted her teeth and managed to lean against the cave wall. What happened to her? "Tossin." Teeth didn't answer right away. The silence stretched long enough for Clara to regret asking. But finally he said, "Settlers brought smallpox 2 winters ago." She was strong, but not strong enough. Clara closed her eyes. "I'm sorry." He inclined his head, acknowledging but not dwelling. Outside, a hawk cried out, sharp and sudden. Clara's breath caught. "They're looking for me," she whispered. "Jeb and his men. They'll come." Tossin. T stood slowly and walked to the mouth of the cave, his silhouette framed against the light. He scanned the horizon. "I know." She stared at his back. "Then why haven't you run?" He didn't turn. Because they would follow. That unsettled her more than she expected. This man, who owed her nothing, had made himself a target by helping her. Jeb didn't forgive, and he sure as hell didn't forget. If he knew she was alive, he'd come with guns blazing, dragging half the county behind him. "You should leave," she said. "Just go. I'll slow them down by you time." Tossin. T finally looked at her, eyes unreadable. "You think I fear them?" Clara shook her head. "I think you're smarter than I am. I think you're stronger than you believe." She scoffed. "I'm barely standing." "Yet you are standing." Clara didn't respond. There was no use arguing with someone who saw through the lies she'd told herself for years. A short time later, Tossin. T brought her food, flatbread, dried venison, and a steaming cup of something herbal and bitter. She didn't ask what was in it. She was too hungry to care. He sat beside her as she ate, close enough to feel his presence, but not so close that it threatened. After a while, she said, "You don't talk much, do you?" He smiled faintly. "Words are like arrows, best used with care." Clara chuckled, soft but genuine. It felt strange in her chest, like laughter had been gone too long. She leaned back, watching him. "So what now?" she asked. "Now you heal. Then we move." She swallowed. "Move where?" "There's a Cheyenne camp east of the canyon. Friends. Safety." Clara hesitated. "They'll take me in?" "They will listen." It wasn't a promise, but it was more hope than she'd had in weeks. Later that afternoon, Tossin. T left the cave to scout. Clara insisted she'd be fine alone. She even half believed it, until the silence settled in like a heavy shroud. The wind whispered through the rocks. Twigs cracked outside. Every sound made her flinch. She pulled the knife he'd left her close, gripping it tight. She didn't want to need protection. She just did. Time passed in slow pulses. When Tossin. T returned near dusk. He moved like a shadow, silent, unseen until he was beside her. He carried a rabbit in one hand, a bundle of herbs in the other. "They've been near," he said as he set down his things. "I found tracks." Clara's heart clenched. "How close?" "Close enough." She ran a hand over her belly. "Then we should go now." "You are not ready." She bristled. "I can ride." "Can you fight?" The question hit like a slap. She opened her mouth, then closed it. "I can try," she said at last. He nodded. That night, he showed her how to load a revolver. Her hands shook, but she listened, learning every motion, every click. "Recoil will surprise you," he said, placing the cold steel in her palm. "Let it move. Don't fight it." She didn't know whether he was talking about the gun or her life. They ate by the fire. The rabbit was gamey but filling. Clara found herself watching him more than eating. The way he moved, the silence he seemed to carry like armor. She'd never met a man like him. He didn't need to fill the quiet with words or praise himself with stories. He simply was present, grounded, unshakable. She envied it. As darkness fell, Clara finally asked a question that had gnawed at her all day. "Why did you help me?" "Tossin." T looked at her, then into the fire. "When I saw you lie in the dust, I thought you were already gone. But you held your belly like a warrior grips a wound. You fought, even in sleep." Clara frowned. "So you helped me out of pity?" No, his eyes met hers. "Out of memory. My wife, she died carrying our child. I could not save them. But I could save you." Her throat tightened. She looked away. "I don't deserve saving," she whispered. "Why?" "I stayed with him. Let him turn me into something I'm not. I knew he was rotten, and I still—" "You survived," he said, voice firm. "You endured. There's no shame in that." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, she said, "I'm scared." "I know." Her voice broke. "What if I lose this baby?" "Tossin." T placed a hand over hers, grounding. "You won't." They sat like that for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the wind hiss beyond the rocks. The cave felt smaller, safer, warmer. But outside, danger moved. Sometime past midnight, a sound snapped them both alert. A twig, too deliberate. "Tossin." T rose in one smooth motion, taking up his rifle. He crept to the cave's mouth, peered into the dark. Clara sat frozen, revolver clenched in both hands. Minutes passed. Then he returned, silent but tense. Someone was watching. Clara's stomach twisted. Jeb. Maybe. Or someone worse. She looked up. Worse. There are men who kill for greed, others for cruelty, and some kill because it is all they know. She swallowed hard. "What do we do?" "We leave before dawn." Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't want to run anymore. But she wasn't ready to fight, not yet. The fire dimmed, and sleep came in restless fits. Dreams of blood, of galloping hooves, of a child screaming in the dark. She awoke before the sun, her heart pounding, breath shallow. "Tossin." T was already awake, wrapping supplies. She stood, swaying, but steadied herself. "I'm ready," she said. He looked at her, not just her face, but her bearing, her steadiness, her steel. He nodded. They slipped into the breaking dawn together, the cold wind cutting across the open land. Behind them, the cave stood empty. Ahead lay danger, but also something more. Freedom, and maybe redemption. The wind knifed across the canyon floor, whipping dust into Clara's eyes as she pressed low against the saddle. Her thighs ached. Her arms burned from clutching the reins. Every jolt of the horse beneath her sent lightning through her belly, but she didn't make a sound, not even when a bullet tore past her left ear and cracked into a tree trunk. "Tossin." T didn't shout. He didn't panic. He simply turned in the saddle and fired a single shot. Somewhere behind them, a grunt of pain echoed, followed by the dull thud of a body hitting earth. "Keep riding," he said. Clara needed no reminder. They left the cave at first light, slipping through arroyos and gullies, following wild game trails to avoid main roads. The plan had been stealth, quiet travel, cautious movement, stay ahead of Jeb's men. But someone had picked up their trail. A pack of bounty hunters, or worse, higher guns with more greed than brains. Whoever they weren't subtle. Just after noon, gunfire had erupted without warning. Now they rode hard, the horses breathing in gasps, sweat lathering their flanks. Clara risked a glance over her shoulder. The scrubland blur behind them, jagged rocks and sun-seared mesquite. No movement, no riders in sight. But she knew better than to relax. Jeb didn't hire men for their conscience. He hired them for their endurance and their willingness to kill. Tossin, T pointed ahead. There, a narrow pass opened in the canyon wall. Steep, winding, almost invisible if you weren't looking. He veered toward it, and Clara followed, urging her mount forward despite her body's protests. Blood trickled down her thigh again. She bit her lip hard enough to draw more. Inside the pass, shadows swallowed the sun. The temperature dropped instantly, and the air smelled of wet stone and sagebrush. Their horses' hooves echoed eerily between the high rock walls. They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythm of hooves and Clara's ragged breathing. Finally, Tossin, T pulled up near a dry creek bed and dismounted. Here, he said, we'll stop. Clara slid off her horse and nearly collapsed. He caught her under the arms, steadying her. You're bleeding again. I noticed, she muttered, teeth clenched. He eased her down onto a patch of mossy ground, hands gentle but efficient. She lay back, heart pounding, every nerve in her body screaming. The contractions had started mid-ride, creeping in with cruel regularity. They weren't close enough to mean labor had truly begun, but they were no longer something she could ignore. Tossin, T knelt beside her, examining the wound in her thigh. It's reopened, he said. Too much strain. You don't say. His brow furrowed. He didn't react to the sarcasm, just focused on cleaning the wound with water from his canteen. Clara hissed through her teeth. We can't keep running like this, she said. They'll catch up. Not if we stop bleeding them. She looked at him. You mean fight? He met her gaze. Yes. A silence fell between them, thick as the canyon walls. I'm not much of a soldier, she whispered. You're more than that. Clara blinked fast, unwilling to let the heat behind her eyes spill over. He said it so simply, like it was a fact, not a compliment, not encouragement, just truth. Tossin, T stood and looked toward the canyon's mouth. I'll set traps. They'll think they're chasing prey. And instead, they'll find something that bites. Clara watched him go, each movement silent as breath. She lay there, staring at the fractured sky above, blue sliced by canyon walls. Her body hurt in ways she didn't know how to describe. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. The baby inside her kicked again, faint but certain. It gave her just enough fire to pull herself up. By the time Tossin, T returned, dusk had fallen. He carried a brace of quail and something that looked suspiciously like rope covered in cactus spines. You're going to tell me what that's for, she said. He set it down. Tripwire. Anyone steps wrong, they'll learn to fly. She laughed, surprised. You got a mean streak. His smile was brief, but it reached his eyes. You're just now noticing? He cooked the quail over a small fire, shielded carefully by a ring of rocks. Clara ate in silence, the food bland but welcome. They'd set camp deep in a fold of the canyon wall, where the shadows ran thick and the stars barely touched the ground. After the meal, Tossin, T handed her the revolver again. Practice, he said. She frowned. Now, they'll come by morning. Her hand trembled, but she took the weapon. A few dry branches and a broken tin cup became her makeshift targets. She missed the first 3 shots. The 4th struck metal. Better, he said. Still terrible. You're alive. She lowered the revolver. For now. No, he said. You decided to live. There's a difference. Clara stared at him, trying to find the right words. Instead, she asked, Why are you really helping me? I know what you said before, but this? Staying? Fighting? He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped softly between them. I've spent years walking with ghosts, he said at last. My wife, my son, they walk beside me still. I saved no one then. I couldn't. But when I saw you, broken, bloody, still holding on, I knew. Knew what? That this time I could choose differently. Clara swallowed. You think I'm some kind of redemption? No, he said. You're a beginning. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning, but not uncomfortable. She felt the weight of it settle in her chest, anchoring her in a way she hadn't expected. That night, Clara didn't sleep. Not really. The pain in her leg kept her restless. But it wasn't just that. Every sound outside the camp set her nerves on edge. The rustle of wind, the cry of an owl, the crack of some branch beneath heavy boots. Just before dawn, the first trap went off. The sound echoed like thunder. Tossin. T was already on his feet, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the canyon's mouth. Clara scrambled up, revolver ready. 3 riders emerged from the shadows. Rough men dressed in trail-worn coats and dust-covered boots. One limped, blood streaking his leg. He'd been the one to trip the wire. Another had a bandana pulled tight over his face, eyes sharp and dangerous. No Jeb, but his stench was all over them. Drop the guns, the lead man shouted. We just want the girl. Tossin. T raised his rifle. You'll get bullets. The man laughed. You think you can kill all of us, Injun? Tossin. T didn't blink. I only need 3 bullets. A beat, then gunfire erupted. Clara ducked behind a rock, heart slamming against her ribs. She saw Tossin. T move quick, fluid, precise. One shot, then another. A scream echoed through the canyon as one man fell from his horse, hitting the ground hard. The other 2 dismounted fast, taking cover behind boulders. Clara's breath came fast. Her hand shook. She peeked out, saw a flicker of movement, and squeezed the trigger. The revolver kicked back. She missed. She adjusted, aimed lower, waited. Another shadow moved. This time, she hit him. A yelp followed, and then silence. Tossin. T advanced. One more shot. The 3rd man crumpled beside his horse. Just like that, it was over. Smoke hung in the air, the acrid scent of gunpowder mixed with dust and blood. Clara stood slowly, legs trembling. Tossin. T lowered his rifle. They'll send more, he said. I figured. But we move now, they'll lose the trail. Clara nodded, eyes hard. She wasn't running anymore. She was surviving. She was fighting. As they packed what little they had, Clara paused by one of the bodies. She searched the man's coat, found a folded slip of paper, a bounty notice, her name scrawled in bold ink, wanted for questioning, harboring stolen gold, alive if possible. Her breath hitched. They think I'm with him, still helping him. Tossin. T looked over her shoulder. That paper doesn't know you. She crumpled it in her fist. Good, she said, because it's about to meet the real me. They left the canyon before the sun fully rose, moving fast over stone and scrub. The air was crisp and the sky wide above them. Ahead lay danger. But Clara didn't shrink from it, because behind her was something worse. What she used to be. She wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. The storm rolled in fast. Black clouds coiling above the plains, wind howling like a wounded beast. Lightning slashed the horizon in jagged forks. Thunder cracked the sky open, shaking the earth beneath their feet. Clara leaned into wind, cloak whipping around her, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the reins of her exhausted horse. They had ridden hard all day, faster than her body had any right to allow. But there was no more time to wait, no safe hollow left to hide in. Jeb was close. Too close. Tossin. He had seen the smoke from their last camp, rising in a dark curl against the sky like a death omen. He hadn't spoken much since then, his jaw clenched, eyes scanning every ridge. Now, beneath the shadow of the storm, Clara's body began to betray her. The first contraction hit like a hammer, buckling her knees and ripping a cry from her throat. She staggered, clutching the saddle to stay upright. Tossin. T turned immediately, already dismounted, his hand on her back. Now! Clara's mouth was dry. Now! Without a word, he pulled her down, lifting her with strength that defied exhaustion. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, turning the dirt beneath them into slick red mud. The plains offered no shelter, but in the distance, just beyond the edge of a ridge, a cluster of cottonwoods and a shallow cave loomed like a promise. He carried her there, ignoring the rocks that tore at his boots, the water that soaked them both to the bone. Inside the cave, it was damp but dry enough to breathe. The wind screamed past the entrance, but it couldn't reach them. Clara lay on a bed of cloaks and saddle blankets, every muscle in her body tense against the pain. Sweat mixed with rain streaked her face, and her nails dug deep into the hide beneath her. Tossin, Dean knelt beside her, preparing everything with practice, careful movements. Water boiled over a small fire, cloths laid out, his knife sterilized in the flame. "You've done this before?" she asked, panting. He met her eyes. Once. She tried to laugh. It came out as a sob. The storm raged outside, but Clara's body became its own tempest. Every contraction slammed through her, like a wave crashing against jagged cliffs. Time lost all meaning. There was only pain, breath, push, and the voice of Tossin. T, steady and unshakable. "You are strong. I'm breaking." "No," he said. "You're becoming." She gritted her teeth, eyes wild, bloodied hands gripping the blanket. "What if I can't?" "You will." The world narrowed to her heartbeat, and the child trying to come into it. And just when she thought she couldn't take more, when the agony split her open like the sky above, there was a cry. Small, piercing, alive. "Tossin." T lifted the baby into the firelight, and Clara's breath caught. A girl, dark curls matted with sweat and blood, fists flailing, mouth wide in furious protest at being born into such a world. Clara laughed through tears, collapsing back as sobs overtook her. Relief, awe, terror. It flooded her all at once. She's perfect," she whispered. Tossin. T.E. cleaned and wrapped the baby with reverent care, then placed her into Clara's waiting arms. "Wiaka," Clara said softly, stroking her daughter's cheek. "That was your wife's name, wasn't it?" He looked surprised. Then he nodded. Clara's voice broke. "She's part of her, and part of me, and she'll be better than both of us." Outside, the storm began to pass, its fury dimming into a distant grumble. But they weren't alone. The crack of a branch snapped through the quiet. Tossin. T froze, then rose without a word, rifle already in hand. He moved the mouth of the cave, scanning the trees. A voice called out, "Well now, ain't this a picture?" Clara's blood turned to ice. Jeb Dawson stood in the clearing, rain dripping from his hat brim, revolver resting loose in one hand. Two men flanked him, one limping, the other tall and skeletal, eyes glittering with something worse than malice. "I heard you die, Clara," Jeb said. "Heard you bled out in the dirt like a kick dog." Clara didn't answer. She cradled Wiaka closer, heart thudding in her throat. Jeb took a slow step forward. "But look at you, all motherly and reborn." Tossin. T stepped from the shadows of the cave. Jeb's smile vanished. "You again." "You won't touch her, Tossin," T said. Jeb chuckled. "You got no say in this." "She's mine." Clara rose to her feet. Her legs shook. Blood still dampened her dress, and every inch of her screamed in protest. But she stood tall, baby in one arm, revolver in the other. "I was never yours, Jeb," she said, voice cold as steel. "You just thought I was too broken to leave." His eyes narrowed. "Put the gun down before you hurt the kid. You hurt this child the second you tried to kill her." The tall man raised his rifle. Tossin. T moved first. One shot, then another. The skeletal man dropped without a sound. Gunfire exploded across the clearing. Clara dropped to her knees, shielding Wiaka, heart pounding like war drums. She heard shouting, the sharp crack of rifles, the crunch of boots on mud. Then silence. She turned. Jeb stood there, bleeding from the shoulder, rage carved into every line of his face. He staggered forward. "You think you're better than me," he growled. "You're nothing, Clara. A stray but somebody took pity on." She raised the revolver. Her hands didn't shake. "You're right," she said. "I was nothing. Until you left me for dead. He took another step. Don't, she warned. He sneered. You don't have the guts. Clara didn't answer. She fired. The shot rang out like thunder, echoing over the hills. Jeb crumpled. The only sound afterward was the wind brushing through the cottonwoods. Tossin. T limped toward her, blood on his sleeve but steady as ever. You're hurt, she said. Not deep. She looked down at Wiaka, sleeping against her chest. She's safe now. Tossin. T nodded. Because of you. Clara breathed in slowly. The air smelled of rain and smoke and something new. Freedom. They buried the bodies beneath the cottonwoods, not for mercy, but for finality. By the next morning, the sky had cleared, the land washed clean by the storm. Clara sat with her daughter swaddled in her arms, watching the sunrise stretch over the hills. You could go, she said to Tossin. You've done more than enough. He shook his head. I go where you go. She looked at him, the edges of her mouth turning up. I was dead, she said, but you brought me back. No, he replied, kneeling beside her. You walk back on your own. Wiaka stirred in her arms, a soft coo escaping her lips. Clara stood, turning toward the rising sun. I'm not running anymore, she said. I've got a life to build. Tossin, T smiled, and together, with blood behind them and a new world ahead, they walked into it. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, because some stories deserve to be told and remembered